This is my true story. I visited my son's grave every Sunday morning for 18 years without missing a single week. He disappeared in a flood when he was 22 years old and they never found his body, so I buried an empty coffin with his childhood belongings inside. I would kneel at his headstone and talk to him and bring flowers and cry until I had no tears left. But one Sunday morning I was whispering, "I miss you," when I heard a voice behind me say, "Dad." I thought I was losing my mind until the voice said it again, and I turned around and saw my son standing there alive. Before I tell you what happened, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so more people hear this story. My son disappeared 18 years ago in a massive flood that tore through our valley and destroyed everything in its path. It had been raining for 3 days straight, and the river that ran through our town was rising higher than anyone had seen in decades. The authorities issued evacuation warnings, but my son was working at a construction site on the other side of town, and he called me to say he was helping secure equipment before the water got too high. He said he would be home soon and told me not to worry. Those were the last words I ever heard him speak, or at least I thought they were the last words for 18 years. The dam broke that afternoon, and millions of gallons of water came crashing down the valley like a wall of destruction. Houses were ripped from their foundations, and cars were swept away like toys, and trees were uprooted and carried downstream. My son was caught in the flood, along with dozens of other people who had stayed behind to try to save their property or their livelihoods. I tried calling his phone over and over, but there was no signal and no answer. I stood on high ground watching the water destroy our town, and I prayed desperately that my son had made it to safety somewhere. When the water finally receded 3 days later, the devastation was beyond anything I could have imagined. Our town was gone. Buildings were collapsed, and roads were washed away, and mud covered everything for miles. Search and rescue teams came from all over the state to look for survivors and recover bodies. I joined the search parties and spent weeks walking through the mud and debris, calling my son's name and looking for any sign of him. Hundreds of other families were doing the same thing, searching desperately for their loved ones. They found dozens of bodies in the days and weeks after the flood, but my son was not among them. I held on to hope that he had survived and was injured somewhere, or had been swept far downstream and would find his way back to me. But as the weeks turned into months and there was still no sign of him, I started to accept that he was probably dead, even though I had no proof. The search teams found his backpack washed up miles downstream, tangled in a tree. It was torn and muddy, but I recognized it immediately because I had bought it for him as a graduation present. Inside the backpack was his wallet with his ID and some photos, and his phone that was completely destroyed by water. The search commander told me gently that given how far the backpack had traveled and the condition it was was unlikely my son had survived. He said many bodies were never recovered from floods like this because they got buried under debris or carried so far away they would never be found. He said I should prepare myself for the reality that my son was gone, even if we never found his remains. I refused to believe it at first and kept searching on my own long after the official search teams had given up. I walked the riverbanks for months looking for anything that might tell me what happened to my son. But eventually, I had to face the truth that he was not coming back. The county issued a death certificate, even though there was no body, because enough time had passed and the evidence suggested he could not have survived. I was told I needed a death certificate to handle his affairs and close his accounts and try to move on with my life. I decided to have a funeral, even though there was no body to bury. I bought a coffin and filled it with his childhood photos and his favorite books and his baseball glove and other things that reminded me of him. I had a headstone made with his name and the dates of his birth and death. We held a service and people came from all over to pay their respects and share memories of my son. I buried that empty coffin in the cemetery on a hill overlooking what was left of our town. Standing at that grave, watching them lower the coffin into the ground, was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life, because it felt like I was giving up on him and accepting that he was really gone. Every Sunday at dawn, I visited that grave without fail for 18 years, and I never missed a single week, no matter what the weather was like or how I was feeling. I would wake up before sunrise and drive to the cemetery and arrive just as the sun was coming up over the hills. I brought fresh flowers every week, usually the yellow roses he had always liked. I would sit on the ground next to his headstone and talk to him about my week and tell him what was happening in my life and ask him questions I knew he would never answer. I told him about how I was struggling to cope with losing him and how empty the house felt without him. I told him about the town being rebuilt slowly after the flood and how nothing looked the same anymore. I told him about people we knew who had moved away or died or gotten married or had children. I talked to him like he was still alive and could hear me because it was the only way I could stay connected to him. Sometimes I would sit in silence when I ran out of words and just stare at his name carved into the stone and cry. The cemetery staff knew me by name because I was there so regularly and for so long. The groundskeeper would wave to me from across the cemetery, and sometimes he would come over to chat for a few minutes. He told me he admired my dedication and that not many people visited graves as faithfully as I did. He said most people stopped coming after a few years, but I had been coming for almost 2 decades. I told him I would keep coming until the day I died because it was the only place I could still be a father to my son. Other mourners who visited the cemetery regularly started to recognize me, and we would nod to each other in shared understanding. There was a woman who visited her husband's grave every Saturday, and we crossed paths sometimes. There was an older couple who visited their daughter's grave on the anniversary of her death each year. We never spoke much, but there was a bond between us because we all understood the weight of grief and the need to stay connected to the people we had lost. That empty plot became the only place where I could still be his father and fulfill my role as a parent even though he was gone. When he was alive, I had been there for every milestone and every achievement and every difficult moment. I had taught him how to ride a bike and helped him with his homework and given him advice about life and relationships. After he died, I felt like I had been stripped of my purpose and my identity as a father. But visiting his grave every week gave me a way to continue being his father by honoring his memory and keeping him alive in my heart. I kept the area around his grave immaculate and pulled weeds and cleaned the headstone and made sure everything looked perfect. I replaced the flowers before they wilted, and I brought small decorations on holidays and his birthday. Other people who visited the cemetery would sometimes comment on how well maintained his grave was and how clear it was that someone loved him very much. Those comments made me proud because they meant I was doing right by my son even in death. The ritual of visiting his grave became the anchor of my week and the only thing that gave my life structure and meaning. I built my schedule around those Sunday morning visits, and I refused to make plans that would interfere with them. Friends and family learned not to invite me to anything on Sunday mornings because they knew I would not come. Some people thought I was being obsessive or unhealthy and that I needed to move on and stop dwelling on the past. But I did not care what they thought because they had not lost a child and they could not understand what it felt like to have your entire world destroyed. Those 18 years of Sunday mornings at that grave were the longest and most painful years of my life. Every week, I hoped somehow he would come back, or I would wake up and discover it had all been a terrible dream. But the cold stone with his name on it was always there, reminding me that he was gone and never coming back. One cold Sunday morning in late October, I was kneeling at his headstone like I had done 1,000 times before. The sun was just starting to come up and the cemetery was completely empty and silent. I had brought yellow roses like always, and I was arranging them in the vase at the base of the headstone. I was whispering, "I miss you so much, and I wish you were here," because those were words I said almost every week. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and my knees were getting stiff from kneeling on the damp ground. Then I heard a voice behind me that made my entire body freeze. It was a male voice that sounded trembling and broken and uncertain. The voice said "Dad" in a way that was both questioning and desperate, like the person was not sure if they should be speaking. My heart stopped beating for a moment, and I could not breathe or move or think. I told myself I was hearing things because grief had finally broken my mind after 18 years of mourning. I had heard his voice in my dreams countless times, but never while I was awake. My hands were still on the cold marble of the headstone, and I could feel the condensation from the morning dew on my fingertips. I stayed frozen in that position, afraid to turn around, because I knew if I looked, there would be no one there, and I would have to accept that I was losing my sanity. I had spent 18 years holding myself together and maintaining my grip on reality, and now it felt like everything was unraveling. I thought maybe this was what happens when grief finally wins and your mind starts creating the things you desperately want to be real. But then the voice came again, and this time it was closer and more insistent. It said, "Dad, it's me, please turn around." The voice was older than I remembered, and rougher like it had been through years of hardship. But there was something in the tone and the inflection that sent chills down my spine, because it sounded so much like my son. I felt tears starting to run down my face, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to turn around, but I was terrified of what I would see, or more accurately, what I would not see. I heard footsteps on the grass behind me getting closer. I heard breathing that was ragged and emotional, like someone who was crying or trying not to cry. I heard the sound of someone dropping to their knees a few feet behind me. The voice said, "Dad, I know this is impossible, and I know you think I'm dead, but I'm here. I'm real. Please look at me." The desperation in those words broke through my paralysis, and I slowly started to turn my head, even though every rational part of my brain was screaming that this could not be happening. I turned my body inch by inch, afraid that any sudden movement would make the hallucination disappear. My vision was blurred with tears, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack right there in the cemetery. I finally turned far enough to see behind me, and what I saw made me gasp and nearly fall over. There was a man kneeling on the ground about 10 feet away from me. He looked like he was in his early 40s with weathered skin and scars on his face and arms. His hair was longer than my son ever wore it, and he had a beard, and his clothes were worn and old. But his eyes were my son's eyes. The same shape and the same color, and the same way of looking at me that I had not seen in 18 years. His face was older and marked by hardship, but the bones and the features were unmistakably his. He was crying and holding his hands out toward me like he was afraid I would run away. He said, "Dad, it's me, it's really me. I'm not dead, I'm here." My mind could not process what I was seeing, and I felt like I was going to pass out from shock and confusion and hope that I was afraid to believe in. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain was telling me this was impossible because I had buried my son 18 years ago and dead people do not come back. But my heart was screaming that this was real and that somehow my son was kneeling in front of me alive and breathing. I tried to speak, but my throat was closed and no sound would come out. I tried to move toward him, but my body would not respond because I was in complete shock. He slowly got to his feet and took a hesitant step toward me like he was afraid I would reject him or tell him to go away. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe I had just gotten shorter with age. He was thinner and his face had lines and scars that told stories of suffering I could not imagine. His hands were rough and calloused, and his clothes hung loose on his frame like he had not eaten properly in a long time. But there was no question in my mind anymore that this was my son standing in front of me. I tried to say his name, but it came out as a choked sob. He nodded and fresh tears streamed down his face. He said, "Yes, Dad, it's me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." His voice broke on those words, and he covered his face with his hands, and his whole body shook with crying. I finally found the strength to move, and I stumbled toward him on legs that barely held me up. I reached out and grabbed his arm to see if he was solid and real, and not just some ghost or vision my grief had created. His arm was real and warm, and I could feel his pulse under my fingers. That touch broke whatever spell was holding me frozen, and I pulled him toward me and wrapped my arms around him. He collapsed against me, sobbing and saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. I held him as tightly as I could, afraid that if I let go, he would disappear. He felt real and solid, and he smelled like sweat and dirt and life. I buried my face in his shoulder and cried harder than I had cried even on the day I buried his empty coffin. We stood there holding each other while the sun rose over the cemetery, and 18 years of death and grief unraveled in seconds. Everything I had believed for nearly 2 decades was suddenly wrong. The funeral had been a lie. The grave I had visited every Sunday was a lie. The death certificate and the memorial service and the condolence cards had all been based on the false assumption that my son was dead. But he was not dead. He was here in my arms, alive and breathing and crying just as hard as I was. My knees finally gave out, and we both sank to the ground, still holding each other. We were kneeling in the grass in front of his own headstone, and the absurdity of that was not lost on me. Here was my son, alive and well, looking at a grave marker with his own name and death date carved into stone. I could not comprehend how this was possible, or what had happened to him, or where he had been for 18 years. All I could do was hold him and feel his heartbeat against my chest and know that somehow God or fate or whatever power governs the universe had given him back to me. He pulled back slightly and looked at me, and I saw so much pain and confusion and relief in his eyes. He said, "I thought you had forgotten about me or moved on with your life." I shook my head violently and said, "I never forgot you for a single day, and I came here every Sunday for 18 years because this was the only place I could still be your father." He started crying again and said, "I know I watched you from a distance for weeks, trying to work up the courage to approach you because I was afraid you would not believe I was real." He collapsed into my arms again, and the story started pouring out of him in broken fragments between sobs. He said the flood had swept him miles downstream, and he had hit his head on debris and gone underwater multiple times. He remembered drowning and thinking he was going to die, and then nothing. He woke up 3 days later in a small farmhouse in a rural area far from our town. A family had found him unconscious on the bank of a creek miles from where the main flood had hit. They pulled him out of the water and brought him to their home because the hospitals were overwhelmed and the roads were destroyed. He said he had severe head trauma and was unconscious for days. When he finally woke up, he could not remember anything, not his name or where he was from or what had happened to him. He had no identification because everything had been washed away in the flood. The family that saved him tried to help him remember, but his mind was blank except for scattered fragments that made no sense. He would have flashes of images or feelings, but nothing concrete that could tell him who he was or where he belonged. The family was poor and lived far from any major town. They did not have internet or regular access to news, so they did not know about the flood or the missing people or the search efforts. They just knew they had found a young man who was badly injured and had no memory, and they decided to take care of him. They nursed him back to health over months and gave him a place to stay and food to eat. They called him by a new name because he could not remember his real one. They treated him like family, and he had no choice but to accept this new life because he had no memory of any other life. He said he lived with them for years, building a new identity on blank pages. He worked on their farm and helped with chores and tried to piece together who he might have been before. He had nightmares about water and drowning, but he did not know if they were memories or just fears. He would sometimes have flashes of a face or a voice that felt important, but he could not hold on to them long enough to make sense of them. The family encouraged him to try to find his past, but without any identification or concrete memories, there was no way to know where to start. He stayed with them for over 17 years, living a simple life in a rural area far from civilization. He learned their ways and their work and became part of their family. They never questioned him or pressured him to leave. They accepted him as he was and gave him a home when he had nothing. He said he owed them his life and he would be forever grateful for their kindness, even though their kindness had inadvertently kept him from finding his way back to me. Then, 6 months ago, he was in a car accident. Nothing serious, but he hit his head again in the same place he had been injured during the flood. He was unconscious for a few hours, and when he woke up in the hospital, his memories started flooding back in waves. He remembered my face first. He remembered our house and our town and the day of the flood. He remembered his name and his life before the water took everything away. The doctors said the second head injury had somehow jolted loose whatever had been blocking his memories. He said the memories came back in fragments over several weeks, and it was confusing and overwhelming. He would remember something and then forget it again, and then remember something else. But gradually the pieces came together, and he started to understand who he really was and what had happened to him. He remembered me, and he remembered that he had a father who he had left behind. He said the guilt of realizing I had spent 18 years thinking he was dead was almost more than he could bear. He knew he had to find me, but he did not know if I was still alive, or if I had moved away, or if I would even believe him. He said the memories did not come back all at once, but in painful, scattered pieces that took weeks to fit together into something that made sense. The first memory that returned was my face, and he said he woke up in the hospital after the car accident and saw my face in his mind as clearly as if I was standing in front of him. He did not know who I was at first, just that the face meant something important and brought feelings of safety and love. Over the next few days, more memories came back, and he realized the face belonged to his father, and that he had a whole life before the flood that had been erased from his mind. He remembered our house and the street we lived on, and the way the kitchen looked in the morning when sunlight came through the windows. He remembered his bedroom and the posters on the walls and the books on his shelf. He remembered conversations we had and trips we took and moments we shared that had been buried in his mind for 18 years. Each memory was like a piece of a puzzle, and slowly he started to see the full picture of who he had been and what he had lost. He remembered the day of the flood more clearly than anything else. He remembered being at the construction site trying to secure equipment as the water rose. He remembered the moment the dam broke and the wall of water that came rushing toward him. He remembered trying to run, but being swept away and tumbling through the water, unable to breathe or see or control his body. He remembered the terror and the pain and the certainty that he was going to die. And then nothing until he woke up in that farmhouse with no memory of who he was. He spent months after his memories returned trying to track down information about his past. He searched online for news about the flood and found articles listing the dead and missing. He saw his own name on the list of people presumed dead. He found records showing that a death certificate had been issued in his name. He searched for information about me and found old addresses and phone numbers, but nothing current. He was terrified that I might have died while he was gone, or that I had moved far away and he would never find me. He tried calling the old phone numbers, but they were disconnected. He tried contacting local authorities in our town, but they dismissed him as either mentally ill or a cruel fraud, trying to take advantage of grieving families. When he told them he was a man who had been declared dead 18 years ago, they said that was impossible and that he needed psychiatric help. They showed him the death certificate with his name on it and told him his family had buried him and moved on. No one would believe him or help him. He finally searched for cemetery records and found the listing for his grave. He saw the cemetery name and the plot number, and he realized that if I was still alive, I might visit his grave. He said it was a desperate hope, but it was the only lead he had. He traveled back to our town for the first time in 18 years and found the cemetery on the hill. He located his own grave and saw his name carved in stone and the dates marking a life that had supposedly ended when the flood took him. He said he came to the cemetery every Sunday morning for the past 6 weeks, hoping to find me. He would arrive early and hide in the trees watching to see if anyone came to visit the grave. For the first 5 weeks, no one came, and he started to lose hope, thinking maybe I had died or given up visiting after so many years. But then on the 6th Sunday, he saw me arrive just after dawn. He watched me bring flowers and kneel at the grave and talk like I was speaking to someone who could hear me. He said watching me grieve for him was the most painful thing he had ever experienced, and he almost could not bring himself to reveal himself because he did not want to shatter my reality. He told me he had tried multiple times to contact me through official channels before coming to the cemetery, but every attempt had been blocked or dismissed. He went to the police station in our town and tried to explain that he was the son who had supposedly died in the flood 18 years ago. The officers looked at him like he was insane and told him it was illegal to impersonate a dead person and that he could be arrested for fraud if he continued making such claims. They said grieving families did not need people like him showing up and pretending to be their lost loved ones. He showed them his face and begged them to at least contact me and let me decide if he was telling the truth. But they refused and said they were not going to traumatize an elderly man with false hope. They told him that my son was dead and buried and that he needed to leave town immediately or they would arrest him for harassment. He said the officers were not cruel, just protective of me and other families who had lost people in the flood. They had probably dealt with scammers and con artists over the years who tried to exploit grieving families, and they assumed he was one of them. He tried contacting a lawyer to help him prove his identity, but the lawyer told him it would be nearly impossible without DNA evidence or some other concrete proof. He said the legal system was designed to protect the identities of dead people and prevent fraud. Simply claiming to be someone who died years ago was not enough, especially when there was a death certificate and a grave and 18 years of documentation saying he was dead. The lawyer said he would need to somehow convince me to voluntarily submit to DNA testing, and even then the process could take months or years. He tried finding old friends who might recognize him, but most people had moved away after the flood destroyed the town. The few people he found did not recognize him because his face had aged and changed so much. When he tried to prove who he was by sharing memories and details about his past life, they thought he had somehow researched the information online. One former friend told him he was sick for pretending to be a dead person and threatened to call the police if he did not leave. He went to the hospital where I had been treated after the flood and asked to see records or speak to someone who might remember our family. But they cited privacy laws and said they could not discuss patients or share any information. They suggested he seek mental health treatment and gave him pamphlets about trauma and delusions. He said every door he tried to open was slammed in his face because no one could accept that someone declared dead 18 years ago could suddenly be alive. So he decided his only option was to come to the cemetery and wait for me. He said it was the one place he knew I might still be accessible without anyone blocking him or calling the police. He spent weeks watching from a distance trying to build up the courage to approach me. He was terrified I would think he was a con artist or that I would have a heart attack from the shock. He was afraid I had remarried or built a new life and would not want him disrupting it. He was afraid that 18 years was too long and that whatever connection we had would be broken beyond repair. But he said watching me grieve week after week finally gave him the courage to speak. He said seeing me kneel at his grave and talk to a headstone like he was still there made him realize I had never stopped being his father. He said the love in my voice when I whispered, "I miss you," convinced him that I would want to know the truth, even if it was impossible to believe. So on that cold Sunday morning, he finally stepped out from where he had been hiding and said the word he had not been able to say to me in 18 years. He said Dad, and waited to see if I would turn around or if I would run away thinking he was a ghost or a madman. We stood at that grave together, staring at the headstone that bore his name and the dates that marked a life that had never actually ended. The absurdity of the moment was overwhelming. My son, who I had mourned for 18 years, was standing next to me alive and breathing while we both looked at his own grave. The flowers I had just placed were still fresh in the vase, and my knees were still wet from kneeling on the damp ground. Everything about this moment felt impossible, and yet it was happening, and it was real. I reached out and touched his face to make sure he was solid and not some hallucination my grief-stricken mind had created. His skin was warm and real, and I could feel the stubble of his beard under my fingers. He closed his eyes and leaned into my touch, and more tears streamed down his face. He said, "I am so sorry for everything you went through and for all the years you spent thinking I was dead." I told him it was not his fault and that none of this was his fault. I said what mattered was that he was here now and that somehow we had found each other again. The sun was fully up now and the cemetery was starting to get light. I realized other people might start arriving soon, and I did not want to explain this situation to anyone until I had time to process it myself. I suggested we leave the cemetery and go somewhere we could talk privately. He nodded, and we walked together toward the parking lot. I kept my hand on his arm the entire time because I was afraid if I let go, he would disappear, and I would discover this had all been a dream. We got into my car, and I drove to a diner on the edge of town that was open early. We sat in a booth in the back corner where no one would bother us. I ordered coffee, but neither of us could eat anything. We just sat there looking at each other across the table, trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. He looked so much older than the 22-year-old boy I remembered, but I could still see that boy in his eyes and in his expressions. I had 18 years of questions, and he had 18 years of answers, but neither of us knew where to start. I asked him if the family that saved him knew where he was now, and he said yes, he had told them everything before he left. He said they were shocked and heartbroken to learn the truth, but they understood why he needed to find his real family. He said they had been good to him and he would always be grateful, but he needed to come home to where he really belonged. I asked him what name they had called him, and he said they had named him Michael because he could not remember his real name. He said it had been strange answering to a different name for 17 years, but it was all he had known. Now hearing his real name from my lips felt foreign and familiar at the same time. He said it would take time to feel like himself again after living as someone else for so long. We talked for hours about everything that had happened to both of us over the 18 years we were apart. I told him about the search efforts and the funeral and the empty coffin I had buried. I told him about visiting his grave every Sunday and how it had become the only way I could cope with losing him. I told him about how lonely I had been and how much I had missed him every single day. He cried hearing about my suffering and kept apologizing, even though I kept telling him he had nothing to apologize for. He told me more details about his life with the family that saved him, and about the moment his memories returned, and about the months he spent trying to find me. He told me about the frustration of not being believed, and the fear that he would never be able to reach me. He said there were many times he wanted to give up, but something kept pushing him forward. He said he felt like he was being guided back to me by some force he could not explain. The weeks that followed were surreal and overwhelming in ways I could never have prepared for. We left the diner that first morning, and I took him home to the house I had lived in alone for 18 years. Walking through the front door with my son alive was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I had kept his bedroom exactly as it was the day he disappeared. His clothes were still in the closet, and his books were still on the shelves, and his bed was still made the way he had left it. When he saw his room preserved like a shrine, he broke down crying again and said he could not believe I had kept everything. We had to deal with the legal nightmare of proving he was actually alive and getting his death certificate reversed. I took him to the police station the next day and demanded they listen to us. The officers were skeptical at first and thought we were both delusional or participating in some kind of scam. But when they looked at his face and compared it to old photos they had on file, their attitudes started to change. They agreed to arrange DNA testing to confirm his identity beyond any doubt. The DNA test took 2 weeks to process, and those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. Part of me was terrified the test would come back negative and I would discover I had been fooled by someone who looked like my son. But when the results came back, they showed a 99.9% probability that he was my biological child. The police were shocked, and the medical examiner who had issued the original death certificate was called in to review the case. They had to officially revoke the death certificate and restore his legal status as a living person. The news spread quickly through our small town, and then to regional news outlets, and then to national media. Reporters called constantly wanting to interview us about the miracle of my son returning from the dead after 18 years. They called it impossible and unprecedented, and an act of God. Camera crews showed up at our house and we had to hide inside to avoid being filmed. The story was picked up by major networks, and suddenly people all over the country knew about the man who came back from his own grave. We had to deal with Social Security and the IRS and banks and insurance companies and dozens of other institutions that had closed his accounts and processed his death. Everything had to be reopened and restored, and it was a bureaucratic nightmare that took months to sort out. His credit history had been erased, and his driver's license had been canceled, and he legally did not exist for a period of time while the paperwork was being processed. It was frustrating and exhausting, but none of it mattered because he was alive, and we were together. We spent hours every day talking and filling in the gaps of the 18 years we had been apart. I told him stories about people he used to know and what had happened to them. I showed him photos and videos I had saved on my phone. I took him to places he used to know that had been rebuilt after the flood. Everything looked different, and he struggled to recognize landmarks and streets because so much had changed. He was learning to navigate a world that had moved on without him. He told me about his life on the farm and the family that had saved him. He showed me pictures of them on his phone, and I felt overwhelming gratitude toward these strangers who had kept my son alive when I thought he was dead. He said he wanted me to meet them someday and thank them in person. I said I would be honored to meet the people who gave me back my son, even if they did not know they were doing it. We were like strangers in some ways, learning each other again after 18 years of separation. His mannerisms had changed, and his voice was different, and he had experiences and memories I was not part of. But underneath all of that, he was still my son, and I was still his father. The bond between us had survived death and time and distance, and we were slowly rebuilding what had been lost. Now we live together in the house where he grew up, and we are making up for all the lost Sundays and lost birthdays and lost time that can never be recovered, but can be honored. We have breakfast together every morning, and we talk about our plans for the day, and we share stories we never got to share during the 18 years we were apart. He is learning to be my son again, and I am learning to be his father again, and some days it feels natural and easy, and other days it feels strange and awkward. But we are patient with each other, and we take it one day at a time. He has struggled with guilt about the years I spent mourning him and visiting his grave every Sunday. He said he cannot imagine the pain I went through thinking he was dead, and he wishes there was some way he could have reached me sooner. I tell him over and over that none of it was his fault, and that what matters is we are together now. I tell him that the years I spent at his grave were not wasted, because that grief was an expression of love, and that love brought him back to me. I truly believe that my refusal to stop loving him and stop visiting his grave somehow called him home. We visited that grave one last time together a few months after he returned. We brought flowers and stood in front of the headstone that still bore his name and his death date. I told him I wanted to leave the grave as it was, rather than having it removed or destroyed. I said it was a monument to the 18 years we were apart and to the love that survived even death. He agreed and said the grave represented a chapter of our lives that was over but should not be forgotten. We said a prayer together thanking God for the miracle of his return and for the family that saved his life. I went back to church for the first time in years after my son came home. I had stopped going after he died because I was angry at God for taking him from me. But now I understand that God never took him at all. God preserved his life in ways I could not see and brought him back to me at exactly the right moment. I pray every day now thanking God for giving me back my son and asking God to bless the family that cared for him when I could not. My faith came back stronger than it was before because I have seen with my own eyes that miracles are real and that God listens to the prayers of a broken father. We have talked about visiting the family that saved him, and I have spoken to them on the phone several times. They are good, humble people who ask for nothing in return for what they did. I have sent them money to thank them, but they always send it back saying they did not save him for money, but because it was the right thing to do. They said they consider him part of their family, and they are happy he found his way back to his real father. I told them they will always be part of our family too, because they gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. My son is adjusting to his new life slowly, and there are still hard days when he feels lost or confused. He has nightmares about the flood, and about losing his memory, and about all the years that disappeared from his life. He sees a therapist who is helping him process the trauma of everything he has been through. But he is healing and growing stronger every day, and I am here to support him through all of it, just like I was here for him when he was a child. I mourned at an empty grave for 18 years, thinking my son was dead and gone forever. Then one Sunday morning he walked up behind me and said, "Dad," and my entire world changed in an instant. God gave me back my life and my purpose and my son. I pray that everyone who has lost someone they love will experience the same grace I have experienced. God is real, and he listens to the hearts that never stop loving, and sometimes he gives back what we thought was lost forever.